Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Virginia Birrell, the CEO of the Australia-China Business Council in Victoria and the National Executive Officer of ACBC. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today from all the localities around Australia and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. For those joining us for the first time today, the ACBC Victoria China Export Program is a partnership between ACBC Victoria and the Victorian Government's Global Victoria Trade Alliance, offering an extensive program for the revival of Victorian business. Through a series of targeted digital workshops exploring export opportunities with China, and as part of the Victorian Government's $15.7 million export recovery package, ACBC Victoria is working to empower Victorian exporters to take full advantage of Australia's largest trading partner, build cross-border relationships and drive Victoria's global economy. The Global Victoria Trade Alliance partners play a crucial role in supporting business in Victoria's export sector to use the in-market expertise of our respective networks, and in our case, to draw on the in-country experience from our 5 international trade and investment offices in China. Our thanks to in-market representative, Victoria's Deputy Commissioner, Nick Henderson, who's based in Chengdu, for joining us online today. In today's session, we'll explore distribution in China, an important and often difficult to navigate phase of an exporter's journey. We've gathered together some of the best and most well-informed experts in supply chain, in-market distribution, IP laws, and China market research to help you optimise and grow your business while ensuring due diligence and strengthening your business relationships and networks in China. Each speaker will give a short presentation followed by a panel discussion. A copy of today's agenda, along with the speaker information, has been sent out to you as an attendee pack. Zach will include this in the chat box below in case you missed it. I see from our registration questions that we have around 40% of today's attendees who are already exporting with varying levels of experience across a range of industries, including agribusiness and food and professional services. Whether you are in the initial phase of export planning or are already navigating the China market, this session will be useful for all of you, and I encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There'll be plenty of time to get to these after the presentations. Many of you also expressed an interest in other Asian markets, including Singapore, Vietnam, and other Southeast Asian nations. We hope much of the advice and market insights today will apply not only to China, but also to other international markets in the ASEAN region. And note that this event is being recorded and a copy will be made available to attendees after the event, along with copies of our speakers' presentations and an executive summary. To open the proceedings and to give us an on-the-ground report from China, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our good friend and supporter, Nick Henderson, the Victorian Government's Deputy Commissioner for China. A fluent Mandarin Chinese speaker and competent facilitator in trade commercial opportunities, Nick has over 20 years Asia-based experience in a range of operational, management, brand building, brand strategy development and strategic roles, primarily assisting companies start up and grow within the complex China market environment. Over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to provide an introduction to today's event. Global Victoria is very pleased to be supporting this ACBC Victoria series of events that unpacks the elements, insights and tools that are important to navigate and create ongoing success in the China market. Today's session is the third of a series of events that focuses on a broad range of elements broken into 3 parts: why China, growing in China, and strategic China briefings. Why China covers FTAs, logistics, shipping, market research, distribution and channel structure, building and maintaining commercial relationships, and tips for creating long-term success in the market. Grow Your Exports covers market research and insights, market diversification, and managing COVID environments. Today's event focuses on several really important areas addressed by fantastic experts in their fields. How best to structure your trading engagement with China, from having the right business model to risk mitigation strategies in place, are critically important. Getting paid and delivering upon commercial obligations is one of the major challenges and issues for new and experienced exporters to a complex market like China. Protecting your core interests by structuring terms of trade and critical issues like IP protection are foundational elements of conducting business in China from the outset. Identifying, screening and engaging with potential buyers and partners is where the rubber hits the road. Conducting the right level of commercial due diligence and building intelligence about potential partners will assist in the screen and ultimately selection process, and is really, really important. And this takes time and it takes insight to understand the legal ownership, the capability claims of potential Chinese partners. A partner may say to you that they have certain channel relationships, they have this relationship, they're doing this business with a retailer. All of that needs to be validated, and obtaining that information can actually be quite tricky. And so working not only pulling on your own resources, but working with professional firms to assist in this process is important. In my own personal and also anecdotal experience, not getting this element right in terms of understanding the capabilities, the legal structure, all of the different elements of potential partners, and really knowing what's going on, and getting that wrong or misunderstanding those elements can actually lead to some significant impacts on the performance of those relationships and ultimately them actually failing. So this is really an area we're going to talk about today. And finally, one of the key ingredients to building a successful China strategy and a China engagement. And it's not just at one point in time. You may think, okay, I'm going to set myself up, I'm going to enter the market, I'm going to get all my strategy in place, going to get my marketing in place, and off we go. The market changes so rapidly because the Chinese market itself, the regulatory environment, the value chains and the way that those value chains are structured, the Chinese consumer are so different to the way they are structured in Australia and in many, many other parts of the world. And so because of this change, conducting market research to understand how to navigate the complexities of the market, but then to do so on a continual basis because the market will change. Things like target consumer behaviour in terms of preferences, in terms of how they purchase, where they get their information about informing a purchase. Elements like that change. They change in a 6-monthly or an annual or a 2-year cycle. So really maintaining a really good program of market research and intelligence is something which is critically important. And I think, once in my sort of 20-year engagement with China, once I feel I understand a certain element, I understand the Gen Zs in tier 1 cities or whatever it may be, you think you understand it, you put a strategy in place, you have your marketing strategy, 6 months later, a year later, the whole environment's changed. So market research is critically important. And then also just going back to the intellectual property elements, and this is something that Danny Armstrong from SW is going to talk about, is that, understanding the landscape, making sure that your trademarks are protected from the outset, what is the market demand for your product, what are consumer needs, all of those things require qualitative research, and China-specific intelligence drives an informed strategy, and this will enable you to be nimble and also be informed when you're going to navigate a very complex, a very competitive, but also a highly rewarding marketplace. And I look forward to hearing from Mark Tanner from China Skinny on the market research elements. Before I conclude, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about the Victorian Government Trade and Investment Network in China. Many of you will know that, that we actually have quite an extensive footprint in the China market with 5 offices in Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, Hong Kong and Chengdu, with over 20 staff focusing on representing Victoria's interests in the China market, in the Greater China market across trade, investment, international education, and also engagement on our important sister state relationships with Jiangsu Province and Sichuan Province. In addition, I also just wanted to briefly share with you that Victoria's Minister for Agriculture, Minister Thomas, opened our new Shanghai Food and Beverage Showcase facility called Vic House on the 18th of October last week. This is a 960 square metre facility south of the Bund in Shanghai, which is a permanent trade promotion platform for Victorian food and beverage companies to engage with potential customers, to engage with their existing customers, to deepen that engagement and their trade with the market, with the China market. And if there are any Victorian food and beverage businesses on this webinar that would like to know more, please do reach out to me. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Back to you, Virginia.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you for highlighting Vic House, because it's a terrific initiative to have that sort of facility on the ground, and I'm sure our guests will be pleased to contact you for more details. It's now my pleasure to introduce Danny Armstrong, the Managing Director of SW Accountants and Advisors, an Australian-owned firm with an 85-year history and global network of over 12,000 professional and 800 plus offices around 16 countries and regions. Danny himself has over 35 years experience in financial services and operations, which include 10 years of living and working in senior roles across Asia. Danny will provide insights into structuring your trade, getting paid, and protecting your IP. Danny will be joined by Toby Graham, General Manager of SW's China office. And Toby will be discussing the topic of due diligence, accessing distribution networks, and help on the ground. Toby is an Asian strategy expert who plays a critical role in connecting clients to real opportunities and resources in China and Asia more broadly to facilitate cross-border trade and investment. Toby is actively involved in serving the Australian business community on the ground in China, and we're delighted to welcome him zooming in today from Shanghai. So over to you, Danny and Toby. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Virginia, and welcome everyone. Great to see many people sign up for the session today. So I know that many of you understand doing business in China and with China very well, but I thought it's important to probably start with the basics. And firstly, the importance of seeking guidance and help from experienced people in market, or people who are very used to dealing with the market when you're looking to trade with China or export to China. Doing business in China is different to doing business in Australia. Like Nick mentioned, very different legal and regulatory and operating environment. So it's important to engage people who understand the differences to help you out. Nick also talked about intellectual property, and I think, if possible, it's very important to think about your intellectual property protection before you start doing business with China. Ensure that your trademarks and logos are registered together with any patents that you hold in your business. Ensure that you register any likely iterations of your website that you might like to use if you're intending to establish an operation in China. We've seen a number of client examples where Chinese groups have registered some of our clients' logos and trademarks and brands prior to our client actually operating in China or dealing with China. And while it is possible to have those registrations removed if somebody is, for example, camped on your brand or your logo, particularly if the company in China is not actually trading under those brands, it's a time-consuming and potentially costly exercise. So always better to try and avoid that by making sure you've got everything registered up front before you start doing business. The next point is around China's closed capital account. And while this isn't important in a trade perspective because trade is conducted on the current account, it is important if you're establishing an entity in China through which to conduct some of your business operation. A closed capital account means that capital can't flow freely into or out of China. And what that means is that any capital that you want to send into China or take out of China needs approval from China's foreign exchange regulator, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, otherwise known as SAFE. So it's very important if you're going to establish an entity in China to make sure you get your capital structure right, because if you have a need to inject additional capital into your business, for example, if your business is doing very well and you need additional working capital, particularly during the early establishment phase of your business, it's not as simple as just transferring money via your bank. You've got to go and seek an approval to increase your capital level and to actually transmit the capital into China. So make sure you get that element right. If you're exporting to China, seek guidance on how to best structure your trade so as to give yourself the best chance of getting paid. It's always easiest for a Chinese company to pay you in their local currency, the renminbi. And major banks can hedge renminbi just the same as they can hedge any other major global currency, like US dollars, euro, British pounds, etc. Many Australian businesses, of course, naturally default to wanting to structure their international dealings in Aussie dollars, because that way they don't have to worry about foreign exchange risk. But you may be able to secure more favourable terms from a Chinese importer if you're prepared to structure your trade in renminbi. And like I said, your bank can help you hedge the risk. Depending on the strength of your relationship with the overseas buyer, you should also consider contingency planning around payment by utilising established payment surety mechanisms available to you, like letters of credit, to give yourself a fallback position if for whatever reason the importer doesn't pay. I'll talk a bit more about this a bit later. And again, leverage resources to help you as you go through that process. So make sure that you're talking to your bank and make sure you're talking to your advisors and people in the market who understand some of the common pitfalls to help you avoid them. If you're going to establish a business entity in China as part of your export activity, then you obviously need to think very carefully about the structure that you use, the type of entity that you establish, and importantly, who you authorise to operate the business, to contract on your behalf, to hire staff, to sign leases, to make payments. A foreign company operating in China needs to appoint a local legal representative, and that person often has sole power to do all of those things on your behalf and to exercise use of the company's CHOP and financial CHOP in China, which are really very powerful operating tools and the signatures of your company, if you like. So if you're establishing a business or a joint venture, think very hard about who you hand control of that operation to. Because when we're establishing a business, of course, everything's hunky-dory, everything's rosy. But sometimes, unfortunately, there's a few bumps in the road down the track, and you want to make sure that you set up the right protection mechanisms so that if you need to do something, you can if things go wrong. On to the next slide. I thought I'd talk a bit about how Australia's biggest exporters structure their trade and why they structure it that way. So I guess to state the obvious to start with, international trade's about a continuum of trust. At one end, if I'm exporting to a new buyer, I don't have any track record with them, I probably ask them for full payment up front before I ship them my goods. At the other end, if I've got a long established track record with my buyer, I've known them for a number of years, they've always paid me without problem, I might be happy to deal with what's known as open account, i.e. I ship them my goods and deliver them before they pay me. And then, of course, there's everything in between, which is potentially where banks come in. Or you might be seeking a staged payment arrangement to make sure you give yourself some protection. You might ask for a deposit up front, or if you have a shipment that's capable of being done in different stages. You might seek payment of each stage before you move on to the next stage. One long-standing mechanism used significantly in international trade as a payment surety is a letter of credit, which I talked about before. And all that is, by another name, is an international bank guarantee. So to mitigate risk, our major food and export resource exporters, in my experience, they contingency plan when they're exporting to China to ensure they've got 3 different ways of being paid for every shipment. First, of course, the primary obligation for payment sits with the importer. Secondly, they'll seek a letter of credit, always from one of China's big 4 banks. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. So secondary obligation, if the importer doesn't pay, sits with the importer's bank under the letter of credit. And they'll also ask their own bank to put what's called a confirmation on the foreign bank letter of credit, which adds an additional layer of payment surety or insurance, if you like, so that if all else fails, if the importer doesn't pay, if the Chinese bank doesn't pay, then their own bank must pay. So in this example, tertiary payment obligation sits with their own bank. Unfortunately, in China, I've seen instances of problems and delays with payment from time to time, sometimes in spite of documentation being correct. So there's a cost to that service to put a confirmation on a letter of credit. But if the Chinese bank is a relatively strong bank, well regarded in international markets, you'd be surprised how cheap that cost might be. Again, talk to your bank about it, talk to your advisor about it, and if they don't know what they're talking about, please come and have a talk to us. One other thing I'd say is that I think many international business operators don't understand that banks do a lot of business with other banks. And one of their core competences is not only understanding the credit risk of their clients when they're lending to them, but also understanding the risk of other banks that they deal with in a credit sense. So if you're going to enter into a supply arrangement with an offshore importer and they propose providing you with a letter of credit from their bank, talk to your bank about how they feel about the bank providing the letter of credit to make sure that they're comfortable and to make sure that you have optimal protection to make sure you get paid. In short, our banks are generally only happy to deal with large, credible, well-rated banks overseas, and they can guide you as to who those banks are in the different countries you might be seeking to export to. Further, our banks and their international trade specialists have a lot of expertise in dealing with trade documentation. So again, you should leverage that expertise when you're working through how you're setting up your trade structure. Ask for their guidance. Ask them to tell you how you should put your documentation together, what documents you should have, how they should be structured to avoid common problems and pitfalls. I've talked about how our major food and resource exporters structure their China trade. I'd now like to talk to you about an example of a medical device company, an Australian medical device company that I saw when I was running the National Australia Bank in China. So I was sitting in the office of the general manager of this company in Beijing one day, and I asked him, how do you structure your trade? This company was manufacturing in Australia, sending their product to China and then distributing in the local market. And he told me that around about 80% of all of their sales in the China market, they were paid for up front. And I said, well, that's fantastic. You can't be any safer than that. So I asked him, what about the other 20%? And this wasn't his exact answer, but this was what he really said. He said, for the other 20%, we're happy to take letters of credit from local Chinese banks. And I said, well, that's pretty interesting. And I'm a bit surprised because, you know, at NAB, our core expertise is understanding the credit risk of other banks. And we won't take that risk. Why will you take that risk? Are 20% of your China sales not that important to you? And of course, 20% of his China sales were important to him. So he then had a very hard think about how he might change that arrangement to give himself better security of payment, I guess. So back to my earlier example, talk to your bank about that. Talk to them about the banks that you might be dealing with overseas and understand their comfort level. The last thing I wanted to talk about is a case that we had in China in 2014 called the Qingdao port fraud. Qingdao is a very large trade port in China and particularly deals with a lot of metals imports to China. And in this particular case, the trade coming into China, the metals, the document that evidenced ownership while it was on the water, of course, was the bill of lading. And when the goods got into the warehouse in the port in Qingdao, then that evidence of ownership changed to what's called a warehouse receipt. And unfortunately, the operators of the warehouse in the port were arranging multiple iterations of finance against the same shipment of metals. When this all came to light, China's Ministry of State Security got involved because there was fraud involved. And what China's Ministry of State Security did was they asked the Chinese banks who had provided letters of credit for some of these shipments to go to Chinese courts and seek orders to stop payment under their letters of credit. We were dealing with the Chinese banks and we said, if you do this, this will be disastrous for your reputation in global markets. And they said, we know that, but we're required under Chinese law to go to the court and seek stays of payment on our letters of credit. So with our large exporters, we as NAD were obliged to pay them under that confirmation arrangement that I talked to you about before. And then we worked through with the local courts and with the local Chinese banks over a period of time, ultimately getting paid back by the Chinese banks. And in due course, we were, and everything was fine. Some of our competitors, I might add, took a more adversarial approach, and I'm not sure they did ultimately get paid. So I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A, and I'll hand you over to Toby.
Thanks, Danny. That was great. And also thanks, Nick and Virginia and the team at ACBC. Good morning, folks. Toby Graham here, tuning in today from the office here in Shanghai. So I'm going to provide an overview of accessing distribution networks and then talk about performing some due diligence in the form of a company background check in China. So let's jump in. The first thing, look, I'd say about distribution networks in China, developing them can obviously be really hard work. So China's a big place, we all know that, but distribution networks are mostly fragmented. And what I mean by that is it's often best to think of China in terms of regional clusters of country-sized units. And then that's further disaggregated at the provincial level into cities. So more often than not, distribution networks are provincial rather than national, although to be fair, there are certainly some vast regional and national networks to tap into as well. On top of all of that, distribution networks in China usually involve a few more layers. So typically wholesalers will sell to an unstructured network of resellers and their own distributors who then have their fragmented network of retailers and so on and so on. So as far as coverage goes, we think the foreign brands or products that we deal with at least, and that have the most successful distribution networks in China, they've grown their networks by having boots on the ground, either with their own operation or with representation. So that allows them to grow their distribution networks with sales teams in multiple cities. It allows them to develop relationships with chains and within those cities, but also to manage their trade with port authorities, custom agents, logistics providers, and the like. For everybody else, the three main distribution channels are through cooperation with importers or distributors that sell on to retailers or via cross-border e-commerce. Profits obviously will be higher when dealing with retailers directly, but 9 times out of 10, I think you're going to struggle to deal with retailers unless you're on the ground. So these days, the role of importers can be multifaceted. Typically, these organizations operate as importers, wholesalers, and distributors. simultaneously. So importers have the capacity to bring the product into the country and sell through their own channels, particularly via their own domestic e-commerce platform. And this has typically allowed distributors to sell directly to consumers, and it's been pretty game-changing in China. One of the distributors that we've been dealing with in China has grown their business over the last 2 decades. Started in Shanghai. They actually supply many of the larger supermarket chains around the country, so they're national, which traditionally formed the base of their business. However, they now regularly tell us that their D2C sales have surpassed their B2B. So the nature of distribution in China has certainly been changed by e-commerce. Retailers include domestic and international supermarket chains, more of the latter than the former, and specialised fruit, veg or FMCG chain stores. Some retailers import directly, others source from wholesale markets. Supermarkets can become strategic partners for marketing and promotion, although that often requires mutual investment for in-store activities. And again, it's far easier to do that kind of stuff if you have boots on the ground. With e-commerce, really, it's a topic I think that deserves its own session, and I know it's regularly covered elsewhere, including ACBC. So I might keep my comments to simply reiterating that there's domestic e-commerce and there's cross-border e-commerce. Domestic e-commerce platforms are unmatched for reach, and there's just so many of them, but you need to have a legal entity in China. And I think with cross-border e-commerce platforms, they can be great, don't get me wrong, but it's often oversold outside of China, and it's often only half the picture. So we've had clients who were paying hand over fist for their flagship store, but at the end of the day, they're one product in an ocean of competition. And when you add up marketing spend, annual fees, commissions, they really didn't see a profit even after a robust 2-year campaign. Not saying that happens in every case, but it does happen often. Simply finding a distributor that owned a retail chain store throughout a medium-sized province turned everything around for them. And eventually they struggled to meet the demand coming from this one distributor. So both can be problems, but fair to say the latter is the kind of problem that you want to have. In terms of local characteristics, as I said, importers often have multiple sales channels. Agents might claim to have exclusive rights to sell products within a particular area. All I'll say here is investigate that. So if that's what you're being told before signing any contracts or trade agreements, China now has even stronger anti-monopoly laws that prevent non-compete clauses with a distributor. So always have the terms of the agreement checked. Wholesale markets, it's worth pointing out that many clients, or many cities, sorry, are famous for certain products. Guangzhou is famous for textiles, Shenzhen for electronics, Suzhou for furniture wholesale markets, Yiwu for small commodities, and so on and so on. The point is, regardless of your product, do your market research. As I said, China's a big place, so you really need a strategy of where to concentrate your efforts to get the best result. Bureaucratic processes can be difficult to navigate in China. I hasten to add, though, that it's become a lot easier than in years past. If you do manage to take the plunge and set up in China, develop your own distribution network, you'll need to establish good relationships with local authorities, regulators, customs, and local operators. And I don't mean that in any kind of mystic sense of the word guanxi, but rather just that you should ensure that you and the companies within your network are good corporate citizens and pay taxes in China. Common dangers, I'm actually going to talk about common dangers in the next section, but suffice to say, do the due diligence, structure your trade, check the contract, pay attention to licensing, permits and compliance. All food imports are governed by China's food safety law, including FMCGs. Nutritional supplements and functional health foods require CFDA filing and registration. And new regulations drop all the time. So some just dropped recently for FMCGs entering China in regard to labeling and registration as well. Logistics and transportation, I might skip in the interest of time. Personal networks and relationships, super important aspect of doing business in China. Mark is going to discuss this after me, so I might leave that as well. Next slide, please, Zach. So that brings us to due diligence. When it comes to due diligence, in my experience, and I hesitate to say this, but many of our clients back in Australia tend to skip it, and they shouldn't. It's human nature, so people often believe that they're a good enough judge of character to work out whether they want to do business with the other party. I get that. But they might have an existing relationship. Perhaps they met at a trade fair or a conference. Perhaps they really like the person, had a couple of meetings in the mainland, visited the factory. Successful orders may even have been placed. But overall, I think our Australian clients tend to walk into these arrangements with a very high degree of trust. What I would say to that is just don't do that. And this goes for exporters, foreign investors looking to set up a company, entering a joint venture, seeking investment, looking for a distributor, or any number of other ways of engaging in China. Never skip the due diligence. If you wouldn't skip it at home, you really shouldn't skip it when you're working across borders in a country with a distinctive legal and regulatory framework and that operates in a different language. In terms of case studies, there's the obvious surface level stuff that comes up from time to time when we conduct a physical inspection of a premises or a factory. So empty factories, for example, addresses that lead nowhere, employees that only exist on paper. To be honest, these kind of pitfalls are out there, but most of the time they're easy to spot, and they're not very many these days. So what's really challenging in terms of doing a company background check is when the operation looks fine on the surface, and it's only when you look under the hood, so to speak, where you start to see or find some red flags. So we had a case recently where one of our clients had found a new supplier for electronic goods and was about to move forward with a large order. But when we investigated, the supplier looked to be having financial difficulties. On top of that, the supplier was demanding a large upfront payment and pressuring the Australian party to move forward. So red flag for us. So I'll talk next about company background checks specifically rather than individual background checks, which are probably more relevant to investment. Company background checks can be done to various levels of depth, tailored on an ad hoc basis, but for our purpose today, and to make it easy, I've broken it down here to 3 levels of depth, and each is basically more comprehensive than the previous one. So the bare minimum, we think, should be a basic background check on the entity or individual in China, which consists of a public record search using information that's readily available through the government's statutory reporting and publicity systems. Areas you want to concentrate on or check include corporate structure, statutory reporting of finances, registered cap, shareholder information, important personnel, and then paying particular attention to fines, blacklists, ongoing arbitration or disputes. On top of that, we would add a media search, so scouring the internet in China to look for any negative press or anything really that can or would harm an association between brands. So you're basically looking for any red flags, particularly with legal disputes, blacklists and fines, or a history of IP infringement, for example, with the objective of identifying any associated risks that might be just sitting below the surface and not visible to the overseas party, who often only has a company profile that's been handed to them. Now, as I said, that's the basics, and you can and often should go deeper than that. Going a bit deeper, we'd do a company background check that includes all of that information, but then we'd add a financial due diligence piece to that as well. So here we would request that the target company in China provides us with financial statements, and we'll also request access to the China's online tax declaration system. So you won't be able to get that kind of access without China qualified CPAs attached, which is why we always engage our partners at Xiaoming China. And the company that you're looking into would need to fully cooperate to provide that access. So the aim with this type of financial due diligence is not really to provide a valuation or an audit. It's much less involved than that. But by digging a little bit deeper, we can then assess corporate income tax status, assets status, and solvency, basically. And the point of all of this is to work out whether the company in China is financially stable, whether it's in a position to place orders and make payments. The final level of depth involves quality assurance or a physical inspection of factories or facilities. To be fair, this is more often applicable to manufacturers rather than exporters, for example, particularly where a large volume of product is being made in China through contract manufacturing. So I'll keep it brief, given that our session today is about exporting, but this type of due diligence, we'd include a corporate background check, public record search, financial DD, and a physical inspection of facilities, meetings with important personnel and the like. Moving on, some common difficulties for exporters. Previously, I think when borders were open and you could fly over and visit the farm, so to speak, this level of due diligence is probably a little bit unnecessary. But I'd recommend trying to find some way of having boots on the ground, whether that's your advisor, could be Austrade, state government rep, chamber of commerce, or even your employee's cousin who has a friend who's a doctor with a niece back in China if you have to. But you can't go wrong with a visit to the buyer's premises. So you might not be able to see the problems that are sitting under the hood like I was talking about, but at the very least, you'll be able to confirm that the business exists and it does what it says it does. Other common difficulties involve obtaining information, which isn't helped with the obvious language barrier. And of course, China's rapidly changing regulatory landscape. So China's statutory reporting systems, corporate social credit, new foreign investment laws, new regulations for FMCGs, etc., and so on. And then for general rules of thumb, and I think I'm going a little bit over time, so I might just summarize and say that the best rule of thumb is don't listen to rule of thumb. So just get the right advice. And then finally, really quickly, because I know we're all looking forward to Mark's presentation, the importance of being on the ground. So you've heard me bang on about this throughout the presentation, but honestly, the best way to access and grow distribution networks in China is by being on the ground. Outside of that, and for exporters with no intention of going that far or starting off, I think that law firms, accountants, advisors, all great ways to find partners or potential partners in China. And you have the added benefit of being able to look within their existing client base, so you know a lot. They'll know a lot about that business and about their situation. Obviously, chambers of commerce, business organisations, trade shows, conferences, and events when travel permits. All great ways to meet partners or potential partners and tap into existing networks and communities. And then FTZs usually have Chinese government support, while regionally you can find Australia's state government officers and representatives, which I highly recommend. They're terrific. And of course, Austrade. All great resources that can help. So that's about it from me. Sorry I took so much time. Back to you, Virginia.
Thanks, Toby, and thanks, Danny, for the earlier information as well. We can always listen. We can listen to you all day. To be honest, you've got so much valuable information to share. So thank you so much for that presentation. Now, moving on now to market research and our final speaker. We're delighted to welcome Mark Tanner from China Skinny, and he's zooming in from New Zealand. So we really do have a very international session for you today. Under Mark's leadership, China Skinny has established itself as one of China's best known and fastest growing marketing and research agencies. They have helped hundreds of Australian and international brands to understand the latest trends, insights and best practices in the constantly changing Chinese marketplace. I'm sure many of you online today will be familiar with Mark's work from the fabulous China Skinny newsletter. If you aren't already on the mailing list, I recommend joining it for a weekly wrap-up on China consumer trends with some insightful commentary. So Mark, thank you very much for sharing your experience with us today on the importance of market research and building relationships in China. And I have pleasure in handing over to you now.
Thank you, Virginia. It's great to be here. Unfortunately, from New Zealand, I'm still locked out, but our office in Shanghai, I'm obviously in constant communication, so keeping up with what is going on. But the reason I chose this title page is if you've been to China and you haven't had Yao Jiao, you've got to have it. That's that strange alcoholic beverage that man's selling. And it used to be part of the initiation when I was in China, when new people started. I think I've eased off on that. But a great beverage which directly translates to medicine alcohol, because it kind of tastes like medicine. But I think it's kind of how China used to operate, how back in the day before people worried about data or insights and market research, they'd just sit out in the street or put their things on shelves and hope that people would sell them. And they'd make relationships, whether it be with the local dog or that was walking by that may pull the owner over or whatever it is. It's all about just getting out there and hoping that people will buy it. But obviously things have changed. New slide, please. And I think this is the way a lot of people probably view China, that everyone has dark hair and glasses and wears a lot of the same clothes. But I think if you've been to China recently, you'll know that how diverse it is. And I think Toby said it really well, just how fragmented the market is. And it's just really important to not view China as one homogenous place. And we've seen it really accelerate since COVID, where people have had a lot of time to reflect and think about what's important to them and all other deep and meaningful things, much like people in Melbourne or whoever else is in lockdown. And as a result, they find it much more important about what is special to them. They don't want products that are the same as the other 1.4 billion consumers. They want stuff that is tailored to them, meaningful to them, their geography, their tastes, their behaviors, what they do for fun, their tribe. There's all sorts of crazy tribes happening in China. So it's really important to understand just who it is that you're trying to reach, rather than just targeting Chinese people or millennial female or whatever. It's not going to get any headway and be a little bit meaningless, particularly in China, as it is so competitive. You've got brands from all around the world trying to get their little share of the China market. And increasingly, you're getting all these incredibly savvy Chinese businesses. So without some understanding of the market, it is incredibly challenging to actually be relevant or resonant with any consumers. So obviously, a big part of that comes from market research. And Zach, if we could, next slide, please. Now, market research is obviously a very broad subject. I'm slightly biased, but it's something that is very, very important. And I'm just using, I didn't know where to start, because I obviously swim and breathe and eat market research day in, day out. So I wanted to give a few examples of just the importance of it for brands coming in or that are already in China, and really to get to that next level and really understanding what's important in the market, and really defining their strategies, their distributors, who they're wanting to sell through, and also the relationships that they're building, which are obviously very important once you understand who it is you're buying and how they buy things, how they research products. So this is from the China Skinny Tracker, and we have China Skinny has about 4 of these interactive dashboards that are updated in real time, and have access to both e-commerce data and then quarterly consumer surveys. So it gives you a really good broad view of the market, and constantly changing. As Nick said, something that in 6 months ago might have been relevant, maybe a little bit irrelevant now. So it's really good to understand just how that market's evolving, which is something we have tried to do with the China Skinny Trackers. So this is from our nutritional supplements or health supplements tracker. And what I've tried to illustrate here is, if you look at the top selling categories on Tmall, you look at weight loss, and this is obvious. There's a lot of quite chubby or bordering on obese people in China now. And similarly, Chinese people, the majority of them still define beauty, which is incredibly important, as being thin. And so weight loss is incredibly important for a lot of consumers, hence it being the top selling category. But if you look down on the green little bars to the right, you'll notice that weight loss only accounts for 2%, or international brands only account for 2% of all weight loss products. Whereas if you look at weight or muscle gain, which is the 4th most popular category, almost 2/3 of all products sold or by revenue is accounted for by international brands. So as a brand coming in and deciding, do we go weight loss or weight gain, you're probably going to want to look at, although it's a smaller category, you're going to have a much better chance of success in that weight gain category. And there's all sorts of other data around it from the tracker, but you can look at the margins are significantly higher, and the rate of success is significantly higher for brands. So it's a really good, I guess, a really high level, but an important example of just really understanding that below those high level numbers, there can often be a lot of nuances that go in and really help determine what it is you want to sell, where you want to sell it. Next slide, please. Now, a question we get asked a lot, and it's come from lots of different countries over the years, but obviously Australia since late 2019 has been a question that has come, and that's just how this touchy subject of geopolitics is impacting consumer sentiment and sales, etc. So I thought I'd use an example from our dairy tracker just to show that Australia, and I'm not going to pretend here, Australia sentiment towards Australian dairy and other products has decreased. That's Chinese consumers are incredibly sensitive, and there are very few countries that haven't been in the dog box with China at one time or other. If they haven't, they're a little bit boring as a country. They don't really stand for much, but everyone's had their go, and generally they'll bounce back as every country that has hit a low has. But obviously Australia is still probably a ways from bouncing back, because it doesn't look like there's much movement on either party's side. But what this illustrates is whilst Australia from a ranking standpoint has dropped from 1.46 in late 2019 through to about 1.1 now, it is still very, very much in the game. If you look at number of mentions, and this is from our quarterly consumer poll, so we've been asking it every quarter for some time now. Australia still ranks as the second most mentioned. New Zealand, I'm slightly biased here, but New Zealand, Chinese do associate New Zealand with milk, kiwi fruit, and not much else. But Australia still ranks very high up there. And similarly, it's not only almost the most mentioned, but it's also has the highest appeal. So whilst, yes, sentiment is dropping, it still is very much up there. And we see this across many, many categories that we cover. So it's not pack your bags and go home because ScoMo and Daddy Shi aren't talking. It's still a case of just things are still pretty real. Australia is still held in very high regard, given their quality, the safety, the health, and just a really positive overall impression of the country's products. Next slide, please. But I think something that's really important is, whilst Australia still scores highly, we can't underestimate the rise of Chinese brands. And I could talk all day about just how incredible Chinese brands have become. In most cases, they are growing faster than the foreign brands. And some of that is due to national or rising nationalism. And that happens in a lot of countries, but in China, it's accelerated with COVID. People aren't traveling. There's been a lot of geopolitics going on, and just there's been not as much exposure to the outside world as during normal or non-COVID times. So Chinese brands have really done well out of this rising nationalism, but I think most of their rise is not due to that, because foreign brands are still considered very good. It's the fact that they have really listened to Chinese consumers. They really understand them. Obviously, they're much closer to the market in many cases, and they've adapted accordingly. So if we use in the top right-hand side, there's suits Chinese skin specifically. So this is in our skincare tracker. And this is also in the beauty tracker. It really scores highly for both mentions, and that's every consumer when they talk about what they want in their perfect skincare product. They talk about it suiting Chinese skin and also ranking it in importance. So it's a double whammy. It's the highest mentioned and the highest ranking. And as a Chinese brand, they really trade on that. They really tell how great Chinese skincare is. But as an Aussie brand, that doesn't mean you can't compete in that area. We know through research that it's very important to these consumers. So what can we do about it as a brand? And if we look at things like the types of ingredients that Chinese consumers see as important, and again, you can get that from the tracker, but things that Chinese consider relevant to them that'll help, that is specifically designed for their skin types, their skin colorings, etc., and incorporate that into, or even in many cases it already might be in there, but heroing that claim in there, maybe some traditional Chinese medicines and TCM in your products. It's also things like having Chinese models in your communications. So it's, in the old days, you used to stand out if you had some white person in this pool of communications in China, and it really caught their attention. And a lot of Chinese brands use white people. But now it's a case of, if you're using a Chinese model, it really does show that it works on their skin, etc. And similarly with local collaborations and things like that can really help show that you aren't just this foreign brand coming in without really understanding or paying heed to Chinese consumers' needs. So I think that's just some very, very high level. I could talk all day with examples, but I just wanted to give some examples that are quite easy to illustrate from the tracker, and just kind of really hone in on the importance of understanding the market and the needs and the constantly changing needs. And once you have that, then you can make sure that you're selling lots so you can get the money out, like Danny said, or you can find the right distributor in the right region. And regional variances are incredible based on what they like in lots of different categories. And then once you have that, you can make sure that you have those right relationships. And as Toby said it so well, having boots on the ground is invaluable. If you can't, it's making sure you use your partners, whether it be SW, China Skinny, or the Victoria government or ACBC, or whoever that do have guys there in China that can take advantage of that proximity. But that's about it for me. I think, yeah, Virginia, I really appreciate you mentioning the newsletter. If you're not subscribed, it's free. It's a quick and easy way. It's designed for busy people to really just get a little bit of a heads up what's happening in the market. And it also forces China Skinny to keep up with what's happening in the market. So I'd suggest going to chinaskinny.com and subscribing.
Thanks, Mark. That's terrific. And as I hear each of you speak, I realise it is such a complex process, and it's just wonderful having such talented speakers speaking. And obviously, our guests, please feel free to contact our speakers. Their contact details will be available. Just contact Zach if you would like further information. It's just a really great resource. Now we move into the wonderful, exciting time of Q&A. So I do encourage you to please put questions in the box, the Q&A box. I'm getting a few coming through here. Let me see. We'll start with questions here for Toby and Danny. What kind of impact has COVID-19 had on the distribution of Australian products in China? Or probably all of you could answer that. So I'll perhaps start with Danny.
Yeah, well, I think, there's been some well-documented examples that have played out in the media that we've seen, Virginia, and I guess the most obvious example is Australian wine, which I saw some statistics in the paper this week. I think the volumes have dropped 77% in a year or something like that. So there's no doubt there's been some products where there's been some impact, but equally there's been a number of other product categories where there's no issues at all. And Toby and I had an example with a client group about a month ago where they were seeking access to Australian land because they were seeing strong demand in the market, and they didn't have the access to the supply that they were looking for. So I think it's a bit of horses for courses. I think the other thing to point out that's been, written about a bit in the media is that Australian business in certain categories has, of course, been forced to diversify some of its markets for particular exports. And by and large, we've done that reasonably well over the course of the last year or so. Still some challenges, like I said, in categories like wine, but in many other instances, we've managed to find reasonably good new markets for our products. Toby, anything you want to add?
I was going to say, Toby, any comment?
Yeah, look, geopolitics aside, I think that when we saw COVID back in early 2020, it kind of hit all products equally in China, regardless of their country of origin. So there was definitely a dip in terms of consumption, and everybody had to look elsewhere. And Danny covered the geopolitical aspects and the trade blocks fairly well, so I won't jump into that. The only thing I'd add is, there have been other disruptions to trade which aren't country specific in China, and I think a lot of that has to do with bottlenecks in shipping and logistics. That's caused a lot of disruption at ports. Worldwide shortage of containers, the cost for shipping has gone up. Same for logistics, it rose dramatically over the last 12 months. So there are multiple impacts in terms of doing your trade with China that you need to consider.
And Mark, any thoughts from you from on the ground, what you're seeing?
Yeah, there's been specific areas such as I think related to COVID, as what Toby was saying, around things like frozen foods have come in with apparent traces of COVID, which have impacted sales overall. Even some fresh fruits come in, and whilst they're mainly on things like seafood and Chilean cherries, I know a lot of consumers are not taking any risks. They still have faith that China's doing a lot better with COVID, so they are more likely to want to buy their own agricultural products than they were in the past. Not saying they're all going, but there's a few that have gone over and tried a few Chinese food that may not have before.
Mm. And then it's nice to look at the positive things here. We've got a terrific question from Guy Thompson from ANZ. And he's asking which Australian product categories are still going strong in terms of demand and market access, particularly as we head into the Double 11 sales period. Any thoughts from any of you on that?
Yeah, Mark's probably got the best data, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think they're pretty obvious, and I'm sure I'd give the same answer as everyone. But your health supplements, dairy's good, beauty skincare is great. Wine was phenomenal, but yeah, it's a lot of those classics, and then there's some random ones that you may not expect that Australia's doing really well in. But yeah, just all the old infant formula, milk powder, a lot of the old classics.
Yeah, I'd only add to that with wool. Seems to also be doing terrifically well in China at the moment, Australian wool. So as far as I know, no blots on that.
And we've also had a client we've been dealing with who's done particularly well with non-alcoholic beverages. And like Mark said, we've had another client who's got I guess it's a supplement, bit of a hangover cure that's been doing particularly well in China, and assumably not from drinking Australian wine. But.
Too true. That's good. So, given that we touched on the deterioration of the relationships between Australia and China, and the question is, do Chinese distributors still want to partner with Australian exporters? Have you got any insights on that?
Yeah, look, I might jump in first. I think that's a good question. My short answer to this would be no. Look, it actually depends, and it's complicated. So I've yet to encounter a distributor that doesn't like Australian products because they're simply Australian per se. So I say it's not a matter of not wanting to partner with Australian exporters. Whether they perceive any risk in partnering with Australian exporters or importing that kind of particular product, that could be a different question or a different consideration. But broadly speaking, if the product isn't subject to a specific moratorium, then at least in my recent conversations, there's still plenty of appetite. But I defer here also to the data that Mark presented, whereas my own sense is coming off conversations and anecdotal evidence. You know, in my conversations, it's when the product or the commodity is perceived to be risky, where we've had distributors asked to revisit in, say, 6 months.
And it's interesting to flip that then and look also at the sort of any reticence of Australian exporters towards engaging in exporting to China. So maybe Danny, you from the Melbourne office, have you experienced anything in that regard?
Yeah, I think particularly probably in some of our food categories, we've seen a bit of that, Virginia, no doubt. We've got a client, for example, who's a large fruit producer and aggregator. They built a significant new facility, really gearing up for the export market. And due to some of the challenges they've faced and concerns, particularly about shipping a perishable good to China and having potential delays at the port or through customs, etc., they've expressed some reticence. On the other hand, of course, which is probably not that relevant to this audience, but our energy and resource exporters are absolutely flying with record prices, and aside from coal, largely no issues. So there still are, and the one I mentioned before, we had a client who was very interested in China, who was very interested in sourcing Australian lamb. But again, there's like Toby said, some reticence around whether there'll be potential issues as it goes through the system. So in some cases, people are saying, let's just hold fire for 6 months and see if things improve.
So that's that. I mean, this is this sort of overall look of, is China too risky? So people are saying, well, give it a bit of time. and make your decision? Do you think that's the attitude that's happening?
I think there's probably an increased level of risk from the perspective of uncertainty in some categories. I think there's mitigation that can happen around that in terms of who you're partnering with, what their relationships are like in China, as Mark mentioned, because we know of examples in the market where, notwithstanding that it's an Australian product X, there's no issue, as long as people have the right relationships and can manage that. But I think as a generalisation, there's maybe an increased level of risk around the uncertainty as to whether things will get through in the same fashion as they used to. In terms of the operating environment around risk, I don't think China is any more risky than operating a business in Australia. It's just different, right? We have our Chinese clients say to us all the time that Australia is a challenging environment for them. And, you know, having run a bank in China, I can assure you that's quite a challenging endeavour in China, but it's no more challenging, it's just different. And you need to get your head around the differences, obviously, in the legal environment and regulatory environment. And in Australia, our Chinese clients have to get their head around differences in the media environment and community expectation, for example, when they're establishing their business, and make sure they've got the right advice and guidance and help along the way.
Mm. Oh, that's good. Just in relation to probably this question for Mark, I think, selling products online, in relation to relationships, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, well, how important is it still to create relationships in China, even though you are selling online? I mean, I'm thinking of all the Zoom meetings we're doing now instead of the face-to-face, you know, the delegations we used to host and all those wonderful relationships. So, you know, has that changed the actual need for the relationship? Do you think that's still important?
Yes, I do. I think the relationship, how they are built and fostered and maintained, has changed. And I think anyone who's spent time in China in the old days with smoky rooms with force feeding yourself with too much baijiu is probably a little relieved that that is not as common as it once was, particularly in the e-commerce space. If you look at companies like Alibaba, who it is, if you're large enough, it is good to maintain a relationship with. But they really have a culture that discourages that boozy baijiu type area. But I think if you are selling on e-commerce, the vast majority of foreign brands sell through what's called a TP, which started off as Tmall partner, but it's kind of morphed into someone that it's kind of like a distributor, but for e-commerce. And just like you wanted to maintain that relationship with the distributors, you really want to make sure that your TP is giving you a lot of love. And many of them will work with a lot of brands. So if you're showing them love, you'll get more love back. They'll prioritize you in their busy days and ideally send you through a lot of data, which can be quite valuable from a TP, which so many brands don't seem to get. So yet it's world, whether you're in China or Australia or wherever you are, I think relationships continue to be very important. And we need to figure out new ways of building those relationships, whether it's Zoom or whatever it is.
And I guess this is a question for several of you. The Chinese domestic brands, and this is, I guess, with a view to the audience saying, well, how do we get into the market? What is our point of differentiation? You know, are the Chinese domestic brands the getting a larger market share? How much of this is due to nationalism, or is it price points, or what is your feeling? Perhaps Mark, start with that, maybe.
Yeah, this is a subject that I'm fascinated in, and we've done a few projects with some large FMCG companies who were being outsmarted, outpaced, outgrown by these very savvy domestic companies. And initially, our first project was, what are they doing from a marketing perspective that we are not? Why are they winning? And as we scratch the surface, we realize it's much bigger than marketing. Yes, in many cases, their communications are more resonant. They're in the channels that some foreign brands have been a little bit slow to adopt. But if you look at what they're doing from a structural standpoint, they make decisions much, much quicker. Like a lot of these brands, they'll have a CEO that's making, even big companies, the CEO makes so many decisions and he makes them really quickly. Whereas we were looking at brands from overseas and they have middle managers in China and they have gates, many different gates to go through, including back in the head office in Melbourne, Sydney, or London, New York, wherever it was. And as a result, these brands were much more adaptable and they were much more attractive for teams, for the youngest, smartest, brightest Chinese people, because these guys wanted to work in a much more dynamic environment. So, and these local places were dynamic. They're also much more risky. They take more risks. They launch many more products, and they're prepared to fail. They have that throw all the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks approach. And so you're getting these brands that are structurally set up to be more nimble. They have much more aggressive sales incentive models. So almost every part of the business is a little bit different than these foreign brands that are coming in with quite a Western mentality, which doesn't always fit in a Chinese market.
Yep. So everyone, nimble is the way to go if you're wanting to.
I would, if I could, Virginia, I would just echo everything that Mark said. Obviously, we don't collect the data to kind of analyze it in that way, but we have plenty of anecdotal evidence. So many of our clients, particularly the foreign brands, and not necessarily in agri or edible products or FMCGs or the like, could be in fitness, for example, but they have a head office back overseas. It's a global operation, so they have ways of doing things, Western ways of operating that are transplanted into China. And a lot of the time, the competitors that come up in China, just as Mark said, can pivot really, really quickly. So they have a couple of advantages that we see all the time. One is being able to pivot quickly, and the other one is localization. They just get it on a level that foreign brands or foreign operations struggle to get it. And the other thing is, when you're talking about pivoting, it could be adapting to a new regulation or a condition in the market. It could be realizing the opportunities presented by new technology. It could be a new platform that comes up. It could be any one of those kind of things. But if you're a foreign operation and the sub is in China, then you have to go through all these layers of approval to get things done in China. So that is a hindrance we see all the time.
So are you therefore saying a structure where you actually have a partner in China? Is that an easier way to really comprehend the market and be nimble and be able to pivot quickly? Is that one option?
I think look, the best strategy to confront that reality is realizing that it's very different over here, providing some kind of autonomy and doing a lot of education for the global operation. So as long as people understand back home in head office what's going on and why it needs to happen quickly, I think people are smart enough around the world to get it, but it does need to be explained a lot of the time.
Okay.
I think, Virginia, we see some instances where, for example, like Toby said, businesses would benefit enormously from having their own person on the ground. But often people are nervous about that for a variety of reasons. They think it'll be costly. They think it'll be difficult. They're not sure if they can trust the person and whatever else. But what we would advocate to our clients is that you have some independent oversight of those people so that you can make sure. And that could be through a trusted advisor. You might have them sitting in an Auscham office, for example, and them employing them and providing some level of oversight, or you may have an independent lawyer or other expert providing some oversight, or someone on your advisory board in China providing some oversight, for example. So there's ways and means to deal with it. You heard me allude to the JV structure before. I think that's where you need to be very careful, because if you don't have mechanisms in place to protect yourself if something goes wrong or your partner falls out of love with you, for example, then they've got potentially a lot of legal clout in China, and you need to make sure that you're set up to deal with that if the relationship's ours.
It's always wise Yeah, wise advice. Just thinking with Nick now, maybe, I mean, and obviously Shinewing or SW has these connections on the ground in China, but how can Australian businesses, Nick, looking to find a Chinese export or distribution partner, utilise Global Victoria's trade and investment offices?
That's a really good question. We have a trade team based across our 5 offices, and businesses can feel free to send an inquiry in if they are looking for some support, and we can have a discussion about the ways that we are able to potentially provide that support. We also, across a number of sectors, have trade promotion activities. So an example of that would be at CIIE, and this is predominantly food and beverage companies. We provide platforms to enable engagement through being a part of that booth, for example, to engage with potential buyers, or on an ongoing basis with food and beverage companies with Vic House in Shanghai. And then also in the coming period, we'll also be having some online business matching initiatives across other sectors as well. So we are well positioned to be able to identify through our network, plus also going outside of our networks, where there may be interested partners looking for purchasing of certain categories of Victorian produced products, and then we can be there to join those dots.
Questions for the for the audience, really, just to think about too. I'm very happy to take more questions, but just a few thought starters that I think the audience needs to think about, and that is, how are you currently structuring your international trade? What currency are you contracting in, and what payment terms are you typically putting in place? Are you using letters of credit for export trade with China, and if not, why not? Is it because of a perceived cost impediment, or perceived that they're inappropriate for the product type, or some other reason? And if you are, what banks are you generally accepting these letters of credit from in China? And also, have you asked your suppliers if you can get better pricing or terms of your contract in renminbi? There's just a few things to throw out there to our audience. We don't have any more questions at the moment, but I'm very happy to get the panelists, asking each other questions or making any other further comments that you'd like, following these latest comments. So please, if you'd like to add more to the conversation, very happy to hear from you.
Maybe
I think it's, sorry, take it away, Ben.
No, you go, Mark. I'll go next.
Oh, I think it's just worth noting that the advantage as a Victorian business that you may have over other states in Australia, that in the past you'd have these doors open by Austrade and the ambassador and federal ministers visiting town and things. And obviously they're not getting as much love as they once did in Beijing. Whereas Victoria as a state has always been a lot more, I guess, friendly towards China. And I think that's reflected, and I'm sure, Nick, you're much closer to it than I am, but I think the average Victorian minister would find it a bit easier to get a meeting in with the right local or national officials in China than other states and even the federal government these days, which is something that obviously around relationships is quite a positive thing to have.
Danny, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh, well, I agree with that. I mean, there's probably been a few flies in the ointment over the course of the last year around some of that contention. But at the end of the day, back in the day, there was a requirement, I think, that each minister in Victoria came to China at least once a year. And, there was some pretty strong relationships built. So I think those relationships don't go away overnight. I think the other thing I'd say, to Mark's point, is there's a big contingent of pretty experienced Australians on the ground in China. In my experience, when I was working in China, and I'm sure Nick can add to this far better, Aussies really like to help other Aussies out and make sure they don't fall into traps. And, I sort of found, certainly when I was working in Shanghai, the access to senior people that you could get was extraordinary. And I think what am I trying to say is if people need help, please reach out to people because they'll be delighted to help you and they'll be delighted to provide you with local insight to try and navigate things and to use relationships that have been established over a long time that don't just fall away overnight because our government is having a few challenges interacting. The other thing I wanted to ask Nick is, of course, governments of all persuasions have and sorry to put you on the spot, Nick, have various different programs, be they grant programs that assist exporters or that target particular categories of export, etc. And also there's been different programs, I think mainly at a federal level, around logistics support, etc. And I'm just wondering if there's things that maybe you could elaborate on that the Victorian government's either doing now or has in prospect to assist our exporters.
Thanks, Danny. That's a really good point. As part of the Victorian government's export recovery commitment, we had a range of different programs, including the Global Gateway program, which concluded a number of months ago, which was grants to undertake research studies and in-market development activities throughout the world to enable the supporting growth of existing export and also new export within market. So that's an example. The other couple of examples are things like Vic House, the program that we've just launched, which is a significant commitment from Victorian government, things like CIIE and the like. And they're the main initiatives at this point. We also, across international education, we've set up a Study Melbourne hub in Shanghai, coincidentally located 50 metres away from Vic House. And then obviously for businesses, there are programs and initiatives like the newly revamped Export Market Development Grant, and then IFAM, which you mentioned as well, which is support for international freight of chilled and time-sensitive products. So there are a number of support mechanisms out there, in addition to the network of offices that we have in Greater China and the support that we're able to provide on a business-by-business basis as well.
Now you mentioned CIIE, and Guy has asked another question. For those who may not be aware, CIIE is the Chinese International Import Expo, huge affair in November in Shanghai. We've got about 2 minutes to go, but any thoughts on the upcoming engagement activities around CIIE for Australian companies, like virtual trade shows, one-on-one networking, and so forth?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, Virginia. This is our 4th year with a booth at CIIE. This year we have 30 Victorian food and beverage companies that will be part of our booth. And we have an ongoing daily program of promotion activities, introductions to products, tastings, etc. And we also are working on a number of very focused networking events, which will be hosted at our Vic House facility. We will be launching an app which will be available for buyers, to provide buyers with information for companies that are part of the Victorian government booth. And then we're working in collaboration with Austrade on their business matching, virtual business matching program. And then we'll also be doing our post CIIE virtual business matching as well, which kind of gives businesses a 360 in terms of those that are actually able to be at CIIE to engage with the buyers that come through, and then also those that are not able to be there still have the ability to do some business matching in a virtual environment. So it's a pretty comprehensive program, although it's going to be a little challenging with COVID restrictions this year in terms of requirements for visitors and exhibitors, but we'll just work the best we can with the situation that we're faced with.
Good luck with that. And I should mention too that we're helping Austrade Shanghai to promote an event they're organising from CIIE. There'll be David Olsen, our national president, will be speaking with Minister Tian on the 5th of November from CIIE. So that'll be a terrific opportunity for, we're promoting that through ACBC. So anyone listening can zoom into that one. So thank you very much for that. And as we close, that's been a very quick hour and a half, which has been thoroughly engaging. And I hope our guests have enjoyed all the information. A huge thank you to our speakers. We just so appreciate your support of ACBC and your sharing your knowledge with our members. It's absolutely invaluable. As mentioned, this session is part of a series of online workshops we're running as part of the Global Victoria Trade Alliance program, and they go through to the end of next year. We have our information about our next program, which is Thrive in China, will be sent out to you after this session. And for ACBC members, our last 3 export sessions are also available in our Insights Centre, so you can jump onto those. If you'd like to get in touch with any of our speakers today, please respond to the follow-up email that Zach will be sending, and we'll be happy to put you in touch. And we're also working through a section of, through a group of not to be missed seminars coming up as well. We have one on China's new privacy laws on the 3rd of November, and we'll be talking about how that data collection will affect you. We have in conversation webinar with the National Australian University on the 9th of November to launch and discuss new research about the impact of Chinese political trade sanctions on the Australian industry. On the 17th of November, we have a 3-state hydrogen update, including special guest speakers from Fortescue Industries and the CSIRO. And if you're not already a member, I encourage you to join, because you get discounts to these and also access to the recordings of the sessions. We have a very short 2-question survey for you to complete when we finish this session, and that'll pop up on the screen when we close. And we'd appreciate you just to complete that to help us structure future sessions, and look forward to obviously seeing you all again very soon. So in the meantime, a huge thanks to all of our speakers. Stay safe and well, and we look forward to catching up with you very soon. Thank you.